Support.
The maestro, please.
End of October, which yes means Halloween, and also means pop analysis. And oddly enough, this one actually fits kind of well for Halloween. Today we'll be looking at Unholy by Sam Smith and Kim Petras.
Sam Smith.
Sam Smith is a singer-songwriter out of the UK, first gaining international recognition with
Oh, won't you stay with me?
and has managed to keep up the momentum with songs like
I'm way too good at goodbye.
Kim Petras.
Kim Petras, originally out of Germany, now based out of Los Angeles, and we briefly mentioned her in last month's Pop Analysis episode. Despite that, and despite the fact that she's also the singing voice of Evelyn, one of the characters from KDA, the League of Legends K-pop group, this is her first pop hit proper.
Background.
Unholy was originally released on September 22nd of 2022, charting just a couple weeks thereafter at number 3. It first topped the global Billboard charts, but now has finally gotten to number 1 on the US Billboard charts as of the end of October. Unholy is the second single off of Sam Smith's upcoming album, Gloria, which is slated to be released at the end of January in 2023. As I just said, Unholy is actually the second single. The first one is
Maybe I am learning how to love me more, just a little bit.
Working on this song, besides Sam Smith and Kim Petras, we have Jimmy Napes, Ilya, Blake Slatkin, Circuit, and Omer Fetty. James Napier, better known as Jimmy Napes, has a number of pop hits to his name, many of them being crossovers from the electronic charts. Some highlights would be
When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be.
and
You don't know your worth. All the things I know that you did.
Ilya should be a name familiar to those long-term fans of Pop Analysis. We mentioned them way back when we did. Since then, they've continued to work with other superstars,
I wanna be your endgame. I wanna be your first string.
as well as obviously continuing to work with Ariana Grande.
Break up with your girlfriend. Yeah, 'cause I'm bored.
Blake Slatkin is another one that we've talked about quite a few times at this point.
Why you always in the mood? Fuck around like I'm brand new. I ain't tryna tell you what to do, but I need you to stay. Need you to stay. I do the same thing. I told you that I never would. So it's about damn time.
In a minute, I'ma need a sentimental man or woman to pump me up.
Since it's only been a few months since we last mentioned him, the only other song he's worked on since then is actually
Let's make some bad decisions. I want you.
Circuit should be another one that long-term fans should remember, first talking about him when we did
I'm a motherfucking star boy.
and then a second time when we did
'Cause girls like you run around with guys like me till sundown. When I come through, I need.
and the pop credits don't end there. Since then, he's worked on
I was out for self. I was up for sale.
as well as finally, we have Omer Fetty, which oddly enough, we also talked about when we did Mood and Stay. But besides those, he's also worked on
Yeah, break up just to make up. You're gone when I'm
and since we mentioned League of Legends earlier, he's also worked on
start walking. Don't ever say it's over.
oddly enough, Circuit was also involved with that one. Unholy is released by Capital and EMI.
Form.
Unholy is listed as a dance pop, hyper pop, and oddly enough, gospel track, is a little over 2.5 minutes, is in C-sharp Phrygian dominant, and is 130 beats per minute. The song opens with a full choir before significantly drawing it back. After that, we get Sam Smith's verse.
Lucky, lucky girl. She got married to a boy like you.
We then get the chorus, which has the return of the choir.
Doing something unholy. He sat back while she's dropping it.
Before going into Kim Petras' verse.
Daddy, daddy, if you wanna drop the attic.
We then have another chorus
We know. He left his kids at home.
before getting into the outro. which obviously then ends the song. Synth. Probably the most simplistic instrument we hear in the entire song, and it's the first one we hear right after the choir. It just does these eighth note figures on C sharp and D, which it spaces out fairly far apart. Bass. The first bass figure we hear is actually quite similar to the synth, mostly just doing eighth notes on C sharp and D. However, you'll notice that we have a lot more half notes in here, and we also have that little figure at the very end, which pitch bends up from that G sharp to an A, and then falls off that same G sharp right thereafter. The next bass figure we get is actually quite similar. Yes, there are not as many half notes, but for the most part, it's just C sharp and D. The big thing, though, is at the end of the phrase, it has that D pitch bend up to a D an octave above. The last unique bass figure we have, again, is for the most part the same, minus these eighth note runs that it does, going A, G sharp, F sharp, E. First doing it quite low, but then repeating it the next bar after an octave higher, making it a bit easier to hear. Strings. The first string part we actually can easily hear is just this connecting figure, going from F natural to an F natural an octave below. The strings get a bit more interesting, though, as we get near the end of the song. That top line is really just doing the main vocal line, which we'll talk about later, with some supporting elements from some lower strings, like those trills, those fade-ins, and even just repeating the exact vocal line an octave lower. As we continue on, we step away from that main vocal line, just doing these hard eighth note figures on top, and that lovely run in the middle of the phrase, which it repeats, and the line below it actually repeats a different part of the chorus, which again, we'll talk about later. As we move closer to the end of the song, things get a bit more spaced out, now having three distinct string parts, given that middle one is really just supporting the harmonies of the upper one. The last two phrases of the bar really just have the strings playing again, that main vocal line, given there are those fade-ins and those low fade-ins, and now we're having the vocal line played that octave lower as opposed to the octave higher we heard before. Of course, right after that, and the final phrase of the song has the strings playing that main vocal line in octaves. Intro. Quite the start to a song with a 4-part church-styled choir. And yes, I do know that some of these only have 3 notes. That simply means that 2 of the voices are actually just singing the same note. There are still 4 unique voices throughout the entirety of this phrase. We then draw it back significantly with the bottom line really just hitting those A's, but we have some ad-libs from Kim Petras on top. That then repeats, but the following phrase is ad-libs from Sam Smith this time. Verse. Starting off with Sam Smith, for the most part, it really still revolves around that C sharp and D that we mentioned in some of the earlier parts. The only difference being is that Sam Smith goes back and forth between C sharp and G sharp, still reinforcing that C sharp note because G sharp's simply the dominant of C sharp, and he then just hangs on those Ds connecting the 2 phrases.
Lucky, lucky girl, she got married to a boy like you. She'd kick you out if she...
In the following phrase, it still is quite similar, given there's a bit more melodic departure, now hitting Ds, F sharps, and even Bs, given at the end of the melismas. And speaking of melismas, we have a very long one on do, going back and forth between C sharp and B.
Ever knew about all the you tell me that you do.
We then essentially go back to what we did before, given it's a bit more interesting. It's not just C sharp and G sharp in the following subphrase, it's C sharp and D with a melisma through B, so it is a little bit different.
Dirty, dirty boy. You know everyone is talking on the scene. I hear them whispering about the
Sam Smith ends his verse pretty much still doing the C sharp D thing, the occasional G sharp, but the back half of that phrase is heavily syncopated on that C sharp before bending down to G sharp on that melisma, as opposed to going up to the G sharp that he's hit before.
places that you've been, and how you don't know how to keep your business clean.
Kim Petras' verse is a little bit different. Yes, she stays on that C sharp initially, given there's that B at the beginning and that G sharp in the middle, but the interesting thing here is the additional vocal layer underneath that. Starting off really just talking, but she hits those high G sharps at the very end of this phrase.
Daddy, daddy, if you wanna drop the attic, give me love, give me Fendi, my Balenciaga daddy.
Moving on through her verse, we still have a lot of C sharps, given we move up to D every now and again, and we have those ad-libs underneath of her just speaking the words she is singing.
You gonna need to bag it up, cause I'm spending on Rodeo. You can wish me back it up, I'll be gone in the AM and he.
As we get to the second half of her verse, things get a bit more interesting. Her main vocal line now goes back and forth between G sharp and C sharp, just like Sam Smith did in the beginning of his, and that additional layer underneath stays on that C sharp for a while. At the very end, though, it starts descending all the way down to G sharp.
He got me Prada, got me Miu Miu like Rihanna. He always call me cause I never cause no drama.
Kim Petras then ends her verse similarly to how Sam Smith did in terms of rhythm. It is very heavily syncopated. Melodically speaking, though, we're going back and forth between F sharp and E sharp.
And when you want it, baby, I know I got you covered. And when you need it, baby, just jump under the covers.
Chorus. The chorus sees the return of the choir, now with Sam Smith singing the main vocal line over top of it. While yes, the main vocal line does fit melodically right in what the choir is singing, notice how it is not always the top note, especially in the back half of the phrase, when the main vocal line starts to more transition into the middle of each chord as opposed to just being the top voice.
Mom it up, now daddy's getting hot at the body shop, doing something unholy.
The following phrase, for the most part, repeats exactly what was just sung, given with different words, and we have that melisma at the very beginning.
He sat back while she's dropping it. She be popping it. Yeah, she put it down slowly.
Once we get to the middle of the chorus, things get a bit more interesting. Yes, the choir starts off still doing 4-part harmonies underneath Sam Smith's vocals, but at the back half of each subphrase, they reduce to just one note, D, singing the octave below what Sam Smith is singing.
Oh, we go. He left his kids at home. We go, so he can get that.
Given right after that, we just repeat the very first phrase of the chorus. Note, in the first chorus, as it ends, it's going to transition into Kim Petras' verse, which is why she has those ad-libs at the very end.
Mom it up, now daddy's getting hot at the body shop, doing something unholy.
In the second chorus, we get an additional choral line underneath, fitting neatly where the initial choir and Sam Smith actually have a rest.
Mom it up, now daddy's getting hot at the body shop, doing something unholy.
From what I can tell anyway, they are just nonsense syllables, but they make a good effort to actually distinguish the nonsense syllables from each other. So maybe I'm just not hearing a word they're actually saying.
He sat back while she's dropping it. She be popping it. Yeah, she put it down slowly.
Once we get to the back half of the second chorus, Kim Petras now comes in, adding this interesting middle line between the choir and Sam Smith. First, mostly just sitting on that G sharp, but finally going up to that A.
Oh, we go. He left his kids at home. We go, so he can get that.
The final phrase of the last chorus is pretty much the same as it was before, but for the first half of that bar, we still do have Kim Petras really hitting that C sharp in the middle.
Mom it up, now daddy's getting hot at the body shop, doing something unholy.
Outro. The outro has the backing vocals at the bottom, singing the middle of the chorus that we talked about before, going back and forth between C sharp and G sharp, given there aren't really any words. We then have Kim Petras on top, saying the title of the song, going A to G sharp. The final phrase of the song essentially repeats that. It's just that Kim Petras' ad-libs are changed. They're now just those yas we heard at the very beginning of the song on D. song has had an interesting timeline, first gaining traction on TikTok, mostly due to the fact that choir opening is quite intense, and actually very quickly getting to the top of the global charts. I'm actually quite surprised it took so long to get to the top of the US charts. It can actually show the difference between the local market and the global market. And oddly enough, because of its popularity, there have been many different renditions of this song. I highly suggest you go check out a lot of the different Okay, so for those that don't have a theory background, C-sharp phrygian dominant is if you take F-sharp, specifically F-sharp minor, specifically F-sharp harmonic minor, which is just raising the last note in the scale, take that scale, start on the 5th note, or the dominant note, in this case, C-sharp, thus making C-sharp phrygian dominant.